So, when you think about the greatest coaches to ever coach in NFL, who do you usually think about? Some might say Vince Lombardi, Bill Walsh, Don Shula, Tom Landry, or someone as recent as Bill Belichick. And what they all have in common is multiple Super Bowl wins with Hall of Fame players to boot. But what if I told you there was a guy who did all of that, but he did it with 3 different quarterbacks? That's never been done before. And so in this video, we're going to talk about Joe Gibbs and why he's underrated compared to other legendary coaches.
And people were saying, who's this guy? I mean, why would you pick this guy to be the coach of the Redskins?
Gibbs had a number of strengths, and the first one that he showed was his willingness to adjust.
I would like to give the Redskin fans the type of team that I think that they would be proud of.
Buggs told him to go see the man.
Before Joe Gibbs became a head coach, he was an assistant for John McKay and Don Coryell. I mentioned Don Coryell in my last video, along with the Chargers, so if you haven't seen it yet, please go check that out. Then, in 1981, Joe Gibbs was hired by the then Washington Redskins, to become the 17th head coach in franchise history. In his first season, the team finished 8-8 and 4th in the 5-team NFC East. That's right, it was the New York Giants, Washington, Dallas, Eagles, and the Arizona Cardinals back in the day. The 1982 season was an interesting one to say the least. Washington started out the season 2-0, but then the players decided to go on strike. That strike halted play in the NFL for 57 days and 7 games would be lost. It's worth noting that this team was one of the youngest in the league. The average year play time between them was only 3.7 years, with 12 of the players being undrafted. With a group with this little experience, there had to be a group of coaches who were at the top of their game, and Washington had just that. The staff included Warren Simmons, Charlie Taylor, and Joe Bugel. Charlie Taylor is important to highlight because he was in charge of the receiving corps. This group would be known as the Fun Bunch, and the Fun Bunch included Art Monk, Charlie Brown, Alvin Garrett, and Virgil Say. If I were to ask my mom who her favorite coach was, she would tell me that it was Joe Bugel. Bugel was vital to the success of Washington. This is the year that he molded a very particular young offensive line. You know them as the Hogs. The Hogs became the fans' favorite group. On this world-famous line was Joe Jacoby, Russ Grimm, Mark May, Melvin Jones, and Jeff Bostic. For what Washington wanted to accomplish, having a good offensive line was crucial, especially when you have a running back named John Riggins. Washington was a team who wanted to utilize the power run. Let's also add that they had a pretty solid defense as well. Actually, they had the league's #1 defense in 1982, allowing only 14.2 points per game. So it was no surprise that this team finished 8-1 in the shortened season. This squad also had the league's MVP as well, and that was kicker Mark Mosley. Yes, you heard that correctly, the kicker. This seems strange, that's because, well, it actually is. Mark Mosley is the only kicker in the history of the league to do so. Washington would win the division and head into the playoffs. In round 1, they were to face the Detroit Lions, and they would handle them easily, winning 31-7. Their next opponent was the Minnesota Vikings. That too was a comfortable victory as they beat them by a final score of 21-7. Then it was on to the NFC Championship game, where they would meet their arch nemesis and rivals, the Dallas Cowboys. If you're not familiar with this rivalry, it's very heated in the DC metropolitan area. I've never been to Texas, so I cannot speak on the seriousness of the rivalry there, but in the DC area, they take it pretty seriously. And meeting in the NFC Championship with a Super Bowl appearance on the line only amplifies it, I would say so. The beginning of the game saw Washington get out to a 14-3 lead, but things got close towards the end of the third quarter, with Dallas clawing back in to make it 21-7, setting up a dramatic finish to the game in the fourth quarter that Dallas would need to score a touchdown to try to tie the game. On that possession, the Cowboys tried to run a play action to dump it off to Tony Dorsett, but Dexter Manley would provide pressure and tip the ball in the air. Darryl Grant got underneath it, picked it off, and scored a touchdown. This made it 31-17 and pretty much cemented the victory for Washington. They defeated their fierce foes and headed to the Super Bowl for the second time in the franchise history. In the Super Bowl, they would face a familiar face in the Miami Dolphins, because on Washington's first trip to the Super Bowl in 1973, it was the Dolphins who denied them of those riches and those dreams. Now it was time for a little payback. And payback they would get. After trailing 17-10 in the first half, Washington kicked a field goal in the third. It went into the fourth, trailing by 4. With 10:28 left in the game, it was 4th down, and Gibbs decided to go for it. I mean, you have John Riggins. I like those chances.
Let's go. Goal line. I left tight wing, 70 chip on white. Ready?
If you're an older fan of this team, you already know what's about to come next. They hand the ball off to Riggins, needed a yard, but he ends up scoring a touchdown after running over Don McNeil in this iconic play. Washington would have the ball again with about 2 minutes remaining. Joe Theismann threw a touchdown to Charlie Brown, and that would cement the victory for Washington, giving Gibbs not only his first Super Bowl win, but the city of Washington as well. Gibbs had officially made his mark, he had arrived, and the league had to take notice. Especially since Washington went right back to the Super Bowl the following year, but Marcus Allen decided to have an out-of-body experience as Washington lost to the Raiders 38-9. In 1984, they won the NFC East title, but lost in the playoffs to the Chicago Bears. In 1985, on Monday Night Football against the Giants, Joe Theismann suffered the career-ending injury, after being sacked by Lawrence Taylor, LT. So, in 1986, Gibbs had to turn to Jay Schroeder to captain the ship, and he did a pretty good job as Washington made it all the way to the NFC Championship game again. Now, this brings us to 1987, and this was another interesting season. After 2 weeks of play, the players decided to go on another strike. It was determined that there would be a lengthy halt to play, and that the teams would have to use replacement players in the meantime. This didn't slow down Gibbs and Washington, though. They won 3 straight NFC East games in October with this team. And if you didn't know, this was the inspiration to the movie The Replacements, starring Keanu Reeves. I don't know if you guys are too young or whatever, and if you're a sports fan, you definitely know what movie this is. Washington, now at 7-3, had games coming up against the New York Giants, St. Louis Cardinals, and those Dallas Cowboys. They beat all of them to improve to 10-3, and they wrapped up the NFC East title once again. But everything was not golden. As I mentioned, after the Theismann injury, Jay Schroeder had to step up as the starter. Even though Washington had a good record, he ended the season with a 48% completion rate and had been pretty inconsistent throughout the season. In the final game of the season, Gibbs had finally seen enough. In a defensive struggle against the Vikings, Schroeder was benched in the second half for Doug Williams. Washington won the game in overtime and finished the season with an 11-4 record, which was good enough for the number 3 seed in the NFC. Their first opponent were the Chicago Bears, who won it all in 1985. Washington squeaked out a 21-17 win, which meant that it was on to the NFC Championship game. There, they would face the same Minnesota Vikings team that they played in the last week of the season. This game was a dogfight. Tied 10-10 in the fourth quarter, Williams connected with Gary Clark for a 7-yard touchdown to take a 17-10 lead. The Vikings needed a touchdown to tie. It would come down to one last play for all the glory.
One down to the Super Bowl.
The Vikings needed to keep their season alive and tried to do so by executing a pass play, but that was broken up by Darrell Green, and that sent Washington to another Super Bowl, their third Super Bowl under Joe Gibbs, making Doug Williams the first black quarterback to go to the Super Bowl as a starter. There, they would meet John Elway and the Denver Broncos, and they absolutely annihilated them. It was never close. The final score of the game ended up being 42-10. Washington would win their second Super Bowl under Joe Gibbs, and Doug Williams would become the first black quarterback to ever win a Super Bowl. He was also the MVP, throwing for 340 yards. So, if you're counting, that's 3 Super Bowl appearances for Joe Gibbs, 2 Super Bowl wins with 2 different quarterbacks, with one being the first black quarterback to do so. Do you feel me so far? Yeah. Okay, let's keep going. After that Super Bowl win, things started to falter a little bit. From 1988 to 1990, Washington only won 1 playoff game. Losing was something that Washington was unfamiliar with. And on top of that, they had another new QB to get familiar with. Taken in the 6th round in the 1986 draft, Mark Rypien wasn't necessarily anyone's first choice. He then became the quarterback after Doug Williams and was the starter for those years where I mentioned they only won 1 playoff game. The good news is that they still had some of that core that they had throughout the 80s. That would prove to be very beneficial as the 1991 season got underway. Washington won their first 2 games in prime time. A Week 1 45-0 blowout against the Detroit Lions. In week 2, they visited Dallas, coached by Jimmy Johnson, and what proved to be a tough game, only winning by 2 points with the final score being 33-31. Gibbs and the crew would then go into cruise control, winning every single game until week 13, where they lost to the same Dallas team that gave them trouble all the way back in week 2. Their second and only loss came in week 17 against the Eagles. Those losses would only be combined for 5 points. They finished the season at 14-2 and headed into the playoffs as the number 1 seed in the NFC, and they were a juggernaut. They were solid everywhere. Overall, the team sent 8 players to the Pro Bowl. The first opponent in the playoffs was Deion Sanders and the Atlanta Falcons. It was a sloppy affair, but Washington pulled out the 24-7 win. Defense only allowed 43 yards on the ground and forced 6 turnovers. 6 turnovers in a playoff game. Wow. The next opponent was Barry Sanders and the Detroit Lions in the NFC Championship game. The same team that they faced in week 1, and obviously they destroyed them 45-0. The Lions were the second best team in the conference actually, and blew out the Cowboys to reach the conference final. They seemed to be a formidable opponent. However, just like in week 1, the boys from the Motor City would be no match. Washington defeated them 41-10 and held Sanders to only 44 yards on the ground. Now, it was time for the Super Bowl. This would be their 4th Super Bowl under Gibbs, and their opponent would be Marv Levy and the Buffalo Bills. The Bills were a juggernaut. They dominated the AFC similar to how Washington dominated the NFC. Buffalo finished the regular season 13-3, led the league in offensive yards, and was second in scoring. Oh, and Thurman Thomas was the league's MVP that year. No big deal. They surely had the makings for a great game. And it was Washington who would jump out to a 17-0 lead at halftime. Then the league grew to 24-0. A couple of field goals extended the lead to 37-10, and that was all she wrote. And so Washington was on top of the world for the 3rd time under Joe Gibbs. He was able to win in 1982 with Joe Theismann, and 1987 with Doug Williams, who again was the first black quarterback to ever win the Super Bowl, and in 1991 with Mark Rippon, who was drafted in the 6th round. So that's 3 different Super Bowls with 3 different quarterbacks, something that has never been done before. Let's also mention the fact that Joe Gibbs is credited for bringing the counter-trade offense running attack to the NFL and was a big reason why his teams were successful. Gibbs also coached 4 Hall of Famers in John Riggins, Art Monk, Darrell Green, and Russ Grimm. Additionally, many pundits believe that 1991 team was the greatest team to ever win a Super Bowl. That is a very high praise in this era. So why isn't he brought up as quickly as other coaches when mentioning the greats of all time? In my opinion, it is because his success doesn't have that dynastic feel to it. Most of these coaches had the same quarterback and the same core of players to help them reach the top. Joe Gibbs didn't really have that. But I think that strengthens the case for him to be named as quickly as others. I mean, take a look at what he did with the strike seasons and with the replacement players. That's pretty impressive. So now I ask you, is Joe Gibbs underrated? Is he not one of the top 5 coaches to ever grace an NFL sideline? I think so, but I want you guys to let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And so with that, thank you all for watching. If you haven't checked out my last video, it's about the 2006 San Diego Chargers. They were one of the best teams to ever win, and they just couldn't pull it through. So that's a great story to look at if you're into stuff like that. And it helps tremendously. Please, if you like and subscribe, it helps the channel grow, gets the videos more out there, because these stories are important for sports. I mean, that's all we have, in the sports world. And that's why we love sports so much, because these stories unfold and we get to see how things play out. So again, thank you so much for watching. And if you didn't check out the last video, please go check that out. Thank you all again. Love you.